Okay. Okay. I'd like to start with a story. The story is as follows. There was a very great Kabbalist, Makubal, of the Sephardi tradition. That means that he was actually from Morocco originally. He was born in Morocco. And his name was the Baba Sali, Rabbi Yisrael Abu Chatzera, very famous Kabbalist. He passed away in, I think, 1987. So the one weekend, one after Shabbat, his Gabbai means an attendant. The Kabbalists, Rabbi, we call him the Baba Sali, for it's like a term of endearment. Baba Sali. Baba is a term they use for Kabbalists. Sali, because his name was Yisrael Sali, for short for Israel. So Baba Sali. One day his Gabbai, his attendant, was not there for the Sabbath. It was prearranged. He wasn't there for the Sabbath. And when he came in late that night, he found the Baba Sali studying, as he usually did. He studied until very late at night, every night. And this night was no different. And the Baba Sali said to him, "Where were you for Shabbat? Where were you for the Sabbath?" So he said he was in Miron. Now, Miron is a town up in the north in the Galilee. And that is where the gravesite of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the Rashbi, the author of the Zohar, that's where his gravesite is. Now, what had the attendant of the Baba Sali gone up there for? Obviously, there's always reason to go up to visit the Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But the ostensible purpose that he was there for was he went up because the Lelova Rebbe, the Rebbe of Lelov, a Rebbe means like a Hasidic rabbi, a grand rabbi. The Rebbe of Lelov, whose name is Moshe Mordechai Biederman, usually spent a Sabbath up in Miron in the week of what's called Baha'alotcha, which is sometime usually in the middle of Sivan, in the Hebrew months of Sivan, the beginning of the summer, more or less. So anyway, the Lelova Rebbe was up in Miron, and the attendant decided he was going to spend the Shabbat over there. So when he told the Baba Sali, the Baba Sali's attendant told him that he was up in Miron with the Lelova Rebbe, the Baba Sali said to him, "Is he still there?" So I said, "As far as I know, he is." So I says, "We have to go there immediately." So the attendant didn't ask any questions. When his master Kabbalist told him it's time to go somewhere, we have to go and we have to go immediately, that was it. He got the car keys or whatever, and off they went. It's a journey of at least a couple of hours, probably 3 hours from where they were in Netivot, maybe more, 3.5 hours. But anyway, I suppose it depends how fast you travel. But anyway, they got up there, and the Tish was still going on. A Tish is a Hasidic sort of gathering. In the Russian tradition, they call it a Fabrengen, a get-together kind of thing. But in the Polish and Hungarian traditions, called a Tish. Tish basically means a table, where they all sit together at a table, or the Rebbe sits at his table and the Hasidim sit around. And the Lelova Rebbe's custom anyway, was to give out Jerusalem kugel. Kugel is a sort of a dish made out of noodles, and actually the original Jerusalem kugel is made out of noodles and brown sugar and tea. Which is then baked. Interestingly enough, it's pretty good tasting, but let's leave the recipes out of the class. Anyway, so they arrive up there very late at night, and the Lelova Rebbe seems to have extended his usual tish for longer than usual. He seemed to have been waiting for someone, and when the Baba Sali walked in, then the Lelevi Rebbe stood up and they hugged each other and so on. They knew each other well. And then they sat down together and facing each other, and not a word passed between them. Silence for an extended period of time, maybe half an hour, maybe longer. And then the Baba Sali got up and he gave he parted from in a very friendly way from the Lelevi Rebbe, and they parted as very good friends. And the Baba Sali went to the grave of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai for a little bit, and then he went back home. Now, the one who is telling the story is someone named Rabbi Grossman of Migdal HaEmek. Migdal HaEmek is a town in the middle of Israel, and he was the chief rabbi of that town. And he also happened to be a follower, a chassid, disciple of the Lelevi Rebbe. So when the Lelevi Rebbe went up to Meron, he would go there too. So he was there, and he's the one telling the story. So afterwards, he had some chutzpah. Chutzpah means audacity, some audacity, cheek, you might call it in English, British English. He had the cheek and the audacity, the chutzpah in Hebrew, to go and ask his Rebbe, what was that all about? You didn't say a word between you. So the Lelevi Rebbe, sort of as if dismissing it, he said, oh, it was just, we came to an agreement that whatever the enemies of Israel would want to do to us, let them do it to themselves instead. Let them do it between them instead. Completely what on earth did that mean? Nobody knew. Until a few weeks later. And a few weeks later, the Iran-Iraq war started for some completely unknown reason. There was no strategic reason for it. There didn't seem to be any reason at all. And it continued for 8 years, from 1980 to 1988. Apparently that is what they had been discussing without a word between them, and they came to this agreement that the enemies should fight each other instead of fighting with us, and that was the end of the story. So, okay, I'm not going to analyze the story per se, but you'll understand why I'm telling the story. You'll get, I think you'll come to understand it shortly. Let me just switch for a minute to a couple of verses. This week's Torah reading is from a section called Pinchas. Pinchas was a grandson of Aaron. Aaron was Moses' brother, so he was a grandnephew of Moses, of Moshe, and he was Aaron's grandson. And he saw some behavior that was absolutely unacceptable to him, and he went and dealt with the behavior in the appropriate way, and was actually rewarded with he was rewarded with the priesthood. In fact, became the high priest at some point in time. In any event, towards the end of this section, there's some very important verses about the concept of leadership. And that's what I want to focus on. That's the subject of tonight's class. And I think you'll understand the story in context soon. Okay, so here we go. These are the two verses. I'm just reading Hebrew first, and then I'll read the English translation. So it's Bamidbar Chov Zayin Tet Zayin to Yud Zayin. Yivkor Hashem Elokei Haruchot L'Cho Basar Ish Al Ha'edah. Let God, the God of all living souls, appoint a leader over the community. Asher Yetzei Lifneihem, who will go out before them. Asher Yavoi Lifneihem, and come in before them. Vasher Yotzi'eim, Vasher Yivi'eim, who shall bring them out and shall bring them in. V'lo tiyeh adat Hashem Katzon asher en lahem ro'an. Let not the congregation of God be with like a flock without a shepherd, without a leader, without a shepherd. Now, if you read the verse over here, you'll see these two, they're the ones that are highlighted in yellow. Who shall go out before them and come in before them? Who shall bring them out and bring them in? This seems to be a repetition. It seems to be repetitive. Who shall go out before them, come in before them? Okay, that's one thing. And who shall bring them out and bring them in? That seems to be the same thing, just in slightly different words. Okay. The commentaries, there's various commentaries that discuss this. And one of the commentaries says the following, that the first words, the words who shall go out before them and come in before them, that's talking about the leader himself, whereas who shall bring them in, out and bring them in is talking about what the leader does with others, what the leader does with other people. Again, who shall go out before them and come in before them is the leader as he is in himself, how he acts in a certain way. Who shall bring them out and bring them in is how he actually leads his flock, how he reacts towards the needs of his followers, his disciples, his students, whatever it may happen to be. Okay, let me explain what I am talking about. There's an interesting insight into this particular verse. When it says that who shall go out before them and come in before them, what does that actually mean? The first part of the verse, who shall go out before them and come in before them. So one of the commentaries explains as follows, that a true leader goes out in front of his flock. Now, some of the commentaries explain that this is talking about in wartime. A true leader goes into the battle at the head of the battle, as Moses did when he went to fight the wars. Generally, he went ahead of everybody else, and he fought alongside everybody else, or rather, they fought alongside him. Similarly, the same is true with Joshua, and the same is true with King David, and so on and so forth. This was the proper way of a leader is to lead the battle, so to speak, lead in the battle. Not like kings do today or have done in the recent past. They sit in their palaces while all the soldiers on the front lines, putting themselves on the line and putting themselves in danger, while the king sits in his palace and so on and so forth. That's not the sign of a true leader. The sign of a true leader is who goes out before and comes in before. In other words, he makes sure that the war is won before he even comes home, before he comes home at all. Okay, that's a simple, straightforward explanation, but there's a deeper explanation, as there is in everything. That one of the deeper explanations, is many actually, one of the deeper explanations is like this. What represents a leader? A leader is someone who goes ahead of his flock. Now, today, politicians, now this was written by someone a couple of hundred years ago, actually, maybe 150 years ago, 130 years ago, something like this, something like that. He said like this. He said, by way of an example, take when you go walking with your dog. When you go out walking with your dog, so the dog always runs ahead of you, and it's always looking back to see if you're following, right? To see if you're coming up behind it. So the dog looks like he's leading its owner, but the truth is he's always looking back. This is the explanation of what our sages say, Pnei Hador Pnei HaKelev. It's a sad generation where the leaders of the generation, Pnei Hador, the leaders of the generation, have the faces of a dog. Now, it doesn't mean that they look like dogs, but it just means they do what dogs do. They turn their faces behind them to see if everybody is following. Basically, this is the way politics is run today. What does everybody else happen to say? What does everybody think about it? And according to the polls and according to the surveys and so on and so forth, so they'll lead according to what they figure out the people want from them. That's not a leader. That is in many ways a follower. In fact, there was a famous British politician who he was he was the head of that particular party, and he was asked if he follows the party line. So he said, of course I follow the party line. I'm the head of the party. That's the kind of leader that we don't need. The kind of leader that follows is not a leader at all. That's a leader who looks more or less like a dog. He's always turning back to see what everybody else is thinking. And dog-like leaders is not what we need. True leaders are people who lead. They set an example, and people follow them because they want to follow them, not because of popularity polls, and not because because the leader is looking back to see what it is that they want. He sets up the paradigm of the way a person should be. This is the way we are going to go. Whoever is with me, good. Kol Mila Hashem Elai, as was the war cry of the Maccabees. Anyone who's with God, come, let's go forward. That is what a true leader is. The other person is a follower. Okay. So that's the first part of the verse. The first part of the verse talks about what the leader is in himself. Someone who has the vision about how things should be, and he follows that vision assiduously. He's careful to make sure that that vision isn't tainted by his own particular desires, that vision isn't tainted by his own particular, let's say, the word is tivers, by his own particular, his desires, or his, in other words, a leader is a leader not for himself. A leader is the leader because of the cause that he represents. He represents a certain cause, a certain idea, a certain concept, and he himself follows that idea through to the end, and whoever follows him is called a follower of that person. Now, again, this is not politics we're talking about. That's the first part of the verse. What's the second part of the verse? The second part of the verse is Asher Yotzi'eim v'Asher Yavi'eim. One who brings them out and brings them in. Now, the simple, straightforward understanding of this is that he takes care of them. He makes sure that they have they have their needs. He brings them out at the right time. He brings them in at the right time, and so on and so forth, so they can have their needs taken care of. But the deeper explanation of this is that the Zohar explains that this whole thing is talking about galut, about exile, the inner exile of a person. What does a true leader do? A leader is someone who brings them out. He brings the individual out of his own exile, out of his state of alienation from himself. His state of alienation from the reason that he or she is here in the first place. A person is here to fulfill a certain duty. A person is not here in order to fulfill their pleasures and satiate their pleasures and so on and so forth. There's nothing wrong with having some pleasures in the world. We're not going to go into that now. There is an ascetic side of things as well, but let's not go into that. The idea, however, is that you're not here essentially to fulfill your pleasures. You're here for a higher purpose. That higher purpose is what you need to accomplish in this world. There's only one reason that you're here, and that's because you have a mission. That mission, for many people, is invisible. People don't know about that vision. I'm going to explain this a little bit more in a minute. We're just talking about the idea in general. So the person's mission has to do with who they are essentially. The mission that you have is tailored by God to you and only you. Only you can really do it. A true leader understands what each person's mission is, and he brings him out. In other words, he brings out that person from their inner exile. He brings them out from their state of I can't do it, that state of I don't know where I am, where I'm going, that state of I don't know what I'm here for, that state of helplessness, and brings them into a state of where they're brought out of themselves. And that ultimately brings them into Vayavi'im. He brings them into a state of holiness. Not only does he take them out of exile, but he brings them into a state of holiness. Not only are they free from where they were trapped previously, but they also have now entered the Holy Land, so to speak. In other words, entered into whatever their mission is in life and embraced it. Okay, let me explain this a little bit more in detail. This is where we get to the Kabbalistic parts. There's a whole concept in Kabbalah which is called zivug. Very, very important part of what you might call the practice. I wouldn't call it practical Kabbalah, but the practice of Kabbalah in daily life. Because Kabbalah is not just theory, it's supposed to be practiced in daily life. One of the things that we're supposed to do, according to the Arizal, and many others, but the Arizal is the source, the primary source for this. It's in the Zohar as well, but he explains it in much greater detail. One of the things that we're supposed to do is we're supposed to engage in what is called a zivug. Zivug. Now, what does zivug mean? Now, in secular terminology, a zivug is really a partnership with someone of the opposite sex. In other words, a partnership would be a husband and wife. That would be the kind of partnership that zivug represents. It could be a bride and bridegroom, or it could already be a wife and a husband and wife. Okay, that's called a zivug. Now, many of the meditations in the writings of Rabbi Chaim Vital, who was the person that wrote down the vast majority of the Arizal's teaching, the Arizal Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, the 1500s in Tzfat, in Safed, the father of modern Kabbalah. So Rabbi Chaim Vital, when he wrote down the teachings of the Arizal, he wrote them down in this kind of terminology that things were compared to human qualities. Now, why is this? Because there are a number of verses that direct us into this mode of thinking. For example, there's a verse in Psalms that says, "Mi basari echazeh Elokah," from my flesh I see God. In other words, if I want to understand godliness, I have to look at how I operate in the world, how I interact in the world, how I achieve things or fail to achieve things in the world. Mi basari, from my own flesh, I can see God in, not only in the way that I'm created, but in the way that I operate, because I was created in divine image, and therefore, by understanding what it is that I'm achieving, or alternatively not achieving yet, or should be achieving, I can understand what it is that I'm supposed to do next. So Rabbi Chaim Vital used this analogy of intimacy with the divine, intimacy with God. He used the analogy of a husband and wife situation, a husband and wife, or a bride and groom. And we find the same analogy used in the Song of Songs, in Shir HaShirim. The same analogy is used of a lover and a beloved, of a husband and wife, of a lover and a beloved. And the question, there's a story that's told about the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov once had an ascent of his soul into a very lofty chamber, and there he met Rabbi Chaim Vital. And he asked Rabbi Chaim Vital, why did you use that analogy and you didn't use a different analogy? Let's say the analogy of a teacher and a student, of a Rebbe and a Chassid. Why did you use that analogy, the analogy of male-female intimacy? So the story goes that Rabbi Chaim Vital handed him a pen and said, if you can write it better, go ahead. If you can write it better, go ahead. So there's this whole concept, therefore, called zivug. Zivug is, again, the intimacy of the soul with God, which is called zivug. It's also called yichud. It's the same idea basically. But there are four aspects of this zivug. There are four aspects of this intimacy. Now, again, you might visualize it in physical terms, but the physical terms are only a metaphor, an analogy. They're not meant to be taken literally. In fact, they're meant to be taken not literally at all. The concept of zivug has four subcategories. There are four subcategories of four types of zivug. One is called zivug face-to-face. That's the proper kind of zivug. That's the zivug that one should have. The zivug that one should have. The zivug that is fully operational and how shall I say, it's almost equal. It's face to face. Both of you are facing each other. That is the ideal type of zivug. Then there's the zivug of face to back. Rather, let me start with back to front, back to face. In other words, the face of the other is pointing towards you, but you have your back turned. When does that happen? That happens when a person is too preoccupied with all kinds of extraneous things. Sometimes they're not such extraneous things. Sometimes they're things like making a living and keeping, educating one's children and providing for them and so on and so forth. But one is too busy to spend sufficient time to meditate and turn around face to face, because a person is tarud, he's bothered and worried, she is bothered and worried about providing and so on. And therefore, that person's back, so to speak, is towards the face of the divine. God is waiting for that person to turn around, but currently that person has his back facing towards godliness, so to speak. Then a level even lower than that is when there's back to face. In other words, the person is now seeking out godliness, but he's become so distant that it's as if God has his back, so to speak, turned to him, or her. It's never really the case, but that's the way it feels. That's the way the person experiences it. That the face of the person is now seeking out, actively seeking, but is at such a distance that he can't find what he's looking for. She cannot find what they're looking for. Okay, and then comes the last and the lowest level of zivug, if it can even be called zivug at this point, and that's called back to back. In other words, they're facing in opposite directions. There's no meeting of minds, there's no meeting of bodies, there's no meeting of anything. They're facing back to back. And says the Baal Shem Tov, this is the case more than any other case where the intercession of a spiritual leader is absolutely necessary. In all of the other cases, certainly face to face, back to face, face to back, all of those cases can be rectified by the person himself or herself. In other words, it takes a certain amount of training and a certain amount of time and dedication and effort, but a person can bring themselves back to the situation of face to face, a divine encounter face to face. This was, for example, the encounter with Jacob and the angel. That's why he called the place Pnuel. He called it Pnuel because it was the pnei, the panim, the face, so to speak, of God. He encountered the divine presence face to face, so to speak. So it's always possible for these first three categories to either be face to face if they are, or to return to a state of face to face interaction with godliness. The problem is the one who's back to back. How does he or she get back. That, says the Baal Shem Tov, is what the verse is coming to tell us. Asher Yotzi'eim v'asher Yevi'eim, that is the job of a tzaddik, of a holy person, of a Jewish leader, is to bring that person back into a situation face to face, because he or she cannot do it by themselves. They need that divine intercession. Now, does this mean that the divine intercession is that you can only go through an intermediary? No, that's not at all what this means. There's no concept of intermediaries in Jewish thought. There's no intermediary that you go to the rabbi and he intercedes with God on your behalf. No, what the rabbi does, or what the rebbe does, what the Jewish leader, the tzaddik, the righteous man, the holy person, holy man or woman, what they do is they bring out your inner essence, so that you can see it, you can experience it for yourself. You know who you are, you know what you're supposed to do. Now, how is this done? It depends. Sometimes it's done in a miraculous way. Usually it's done in a more natural way, that the person doesn't even necessarily know that it's happening. It just happens over a period of time, that the person comes more into contact with themselves, becomes more stable, becomes more aware of who they are and what they should be doing. It could be sort of gentle suggestions or hints or whatever it may happen to be. But nevertheless, the person starts to find their feet in spiritual matters, until eventually, with perseverance and with effort and with a lot of thought and meditation, the person can turn around eventually to be once again face to face with their, might call it their higher consciousness, face to face with the spark of godliness that's inside them. And that's what Moses did. That's the whole concept of Moses, as it explains. If you want to look this up, any of you might want to look it up in Tanya, in a work called Tanya, in chapter 42, in the beginning of chapter 42, he speaks about this, that every one of us has a spark of Moses within our own souls, right? All of us have a spark of Moses or Moshe within the soul, and that spark is what leads us to divine encounters, even though they may seem to be beyond us, but nevertheless, that's what leads us to these divine encounters. So that can be done either from the internal spark that one has, or it can be done also by a tzaddik who's a representative. He's one of the ones that Moses is asking God to appoint to bring those who are far away, to turn them around towards godliness, so that they're facing, rather than with their backs facing to God, looking in the wrong direction, so to speak. So that's the concept of leadership. Leadership, therefore, is bringing a person into a face-to-face encounter with the divine. The face-to-face encounter initially might be from a distance, but eventually it comes closer and closer until one can achieve the commandment, or the mitzvah, the good deed, I don't know a better term for it, of what's called the dveikut. Dveikut in Hebrew means to cleave to. This concept of cleaving to God is a very important one. In fact, it is itself one of the mitzvot, one of the commandments in the Torah. Uvot tidbekun, there's actually a number of different verses that discuss it. To cleave to God directly without intermediaries. But what sometimes is necessary is that someone takes you by the hands and brings you to the realization of how you can bring out your inner essence, or how your inner essence can once again cleave to the Almighty, as it did originally before your soul descended down into this world. So that's what a leader is, according to Kabbalah. A leader is someone who can bring you face to face with your true self, face to face with your root up above. In other words, with your root in God up above. That is called zivug panim b'panim, and that is essentially what this whole verse is about, or these two verses are about. The shepherd who brings in the flock are those that bring the flock to their proper place of nourishment, where they can be fully nourished and fully protected. Okay, Any questions, ladies and gentlemen? We discussed that agreement at some point. When someone does something mean, I always pray that they receive the act so that they know what they did to others. If one's heart is in the right place, is it okay? If your heart is in the right place, yeah, sometimes the heart is in the right place and yet the actions they miss the mark. My wife was teaching a class on parenting and she said a very true thing. Everyone sort of thinks that kids ought to understand their parents and they ought to be able to just fit in right immediately with the family and do what they're supposed to do. I mean, after all, they are human beings, they are intelligent, they're they might only be 4 or 5 or 6 years old, but they're supposed to fit in. Says my wife to the people in the class, when you get a new puppy, do you have to train the puppy? You have to toilet train the puppy, and you have to train the puppy to not bark when everybody's sleeping, and so on and so forth. You have to train a puppy, right? If you don't train the puppy is going to be wild, and you'll be very disappointed later on. The same is true. Of course, it's a difference, but the same is true of children. Children have to be trained, right? They have to be trained, and they have to be instructed in the ways of the family, instructed in the ways of, and it has to be done gently. You don't have to do it with a whip or a stick. It can be done with love, and it can be done with wisdom, but people need to be directed. So if the heart is in the right place, it's a good start, but the voice has to follow the heart and express one's expectations and so on and so forth. Is that that was an answer to a question, actually. Okay, I'm adults wishing horrors upon others. Yeah, adults wishing horrors upon others. Yeah, I hear what you say. Yeah, I never really understood that. How it could be that people could be so verbally abusive. I mean, I understand how it can be. I've seen it. Unfortunately, I do counseling, and unfortunately, you see a tremendous amount of verbal, even physical abuse, unfortunately. And usually the abuser actually has let's call it a missing part of himself or herself that they don't want to face, and they sort of take it out on somebody else. That person is missing something in their heart, in their soul, and they're taking it out on somebody else. Yeah, so that's why abusers is, in some cases, there's nothing to be done with an abuser other than put them in prison. Maybe that will wake them up. Maybe. Maybe. But the solution is certainly not to give into the abuse. Somehow abusers manage to convince the abused that it's usually their fault. It's the fault of the abused rather than the abuser. And that is because the person does not have the proper self-image and the proper sense of right and wrong. There is always a value in keeping marriage together, for example. There's a value in it, but the value has to be weighed against other things as well. It's not a supreme value that must always be done at all times. No, in some cases, it's much better that the marriage is dissolved rather than, and sometimes sooner rather than later, rather than wait for the spiritual or even physical demise of the abused. Unfortunately, does happen, as everybody knows. Okay. Terry asks, I would like to know what made Abraham such a great leader. What were his qualities and how did he cultivate them? His qualities, his primary quality is love. He was a very loving person. He was a person that did not, I wouldn't say he didn't see the bad in others, but he never looked for the bad in others. He only looked for the good in others, and he brought it to the fore. And that's really what I've been talking about. That's what a Rebbe does. That's what a leader, a true leader, brings out the best in other people. He brings out their best, not his best, their best. And that's essentially what Abraham did. With everybody that he encountered, he brought out their highest inequalities to such an extent that they themselves very often were astonished that they even had these qualities in the first place. And that was his modus operandi, and that's what we try to emulate in one way or another. Many people emulate it through the attempt to be kind and to show kindness and to show love towards others. Others perhaps do it in different ways, but that's what most leaders do it in this particular way. They do it through kindness to others. I hope that answers your question. Of course, there's more to it than that, but perhaps we can go through it in a lesson in the future. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? Abraham also did not, he didn't, what's the word in Hebrew? It's called mefaneko et atzmo. He didn't spoil himself. In other words, he didn't pander to his own needs, his own desires. He understood that there was the Midrash rabbinic literature explains that God showed Abraham a burning city, and he showed him a burning city, and he said to Abraham, what are you going to do about it? And Abraham understood that his mission in the world was to put out the fire of self-destruction, essentially, the fire of, well, it was a fire of idolatry and many other things, but put out the fire of evil in the world to whatever extent he could do that. And that has to be done by people in the world. You can't expect God to do everything. That has to be done by us on our terms. In other words, using whatever powers we have to vanquish the forces of evil and to bolster and boost the forces of good, the forces of light as opposed to the forces of darkness. That's what we're supposed to do, and that's what Abraham did. That's why he's called Avraham Ezrachi. He's sometimes called Abraham the luminous one, the shiner, the one who shines, from the word zoreach, which means to shine, because in Psalms that he's addressed that way. Eitan HaEzrachi, that's what he's called, the mighty one who shines forth, because the greatest power that a person has is power of self-conquest. Conquest of others, maybe they're weak and it's easy to overcome them. To overcome oneself is always an uphill battle. That is the most difficult battle that most people face, to overcome oneself. Okay, any other questions? Yeah. Sometimes to overcome oneself means to overcome one's, what's called in Hebrew the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is usually translated as the evil inclination, but it would be better translated as the inclination towards evil. In other words, the inclination to do things which are bad for you and bad for others. The inclination towards evil. Evil has a very strong pull, a magnetic, charismatic pull on people. And that's why people like Charles Manson were so successful, because they had that magnetic, charismatic pull, just like our Yetzer Hara does, our evil inclination, our inclination towards evil, has this pull, this magnetic pull that pulls us towards our own self-destruction, essentially. And that is what we try to overcome. We try to overcome that pull. We have to pull towards something else. We have to pull towards the light. We have to pull towards what we know is ultimately the best thing for ourselves, even though there might be some temporary pain in getting there. In other words, one has to restrain oneself, restrict oneself to a certain extent in order to be able to overcome and win that battle. Is it electromagnetic or just magnetic? Well, yes. It is the most powerful magnet that there is. In fact, they just it's just a new magnet that they're putting together now in France. It's an electromagnet that is the biggest magnet that the world has ever known, and it is extremely powerful. I want to use it for to create fusion, to fuse things together. But let me tell you something. That magnet that you have in yourself, called your soul, if you know how to manifest your soul in the proper way, that's the most powerful electric magnet that causes fusion of you with others around you. That's called, or fusion of you and God. That's what's called zivug panim b'panim, the intimacy face to face with the divine. That's the electromagnetic field that we try and cultivate and develop and revolve around for as long as we can. Did God speak to Abraham his whole life? Yes, he spoke. Well, I don't know about his whole life, but from when he was fairly young, yes. He started searching himself, and then he had a divine encounter, and then from that time on, he spoke regularly to God. God spoke to him. Okay, any other questions? So the next class again will be on next Wednesday, and hopefully we will have a class Thursday as well, and so it'll go on. Okay, all the best, everybody. See you all. I'll put it up on YouTube sooner or later. All the best. You're welcome. Shabbat shalom, everybody.